We're going to be learning by using ourselves as a case. People learn best, particularly areas of practice, from experience. You can't learn to be a camera person by just reading a book. You can't learn to drive a car by reading about it. You have to finally get behind a car or get behind a camera. So it's the doing of things that enables people to learn and to make it real, so that it begins to get into their heart and their mind and their body, and they know how to operate differently. And leadership itself is a practice. We're not just studying leadership as an academic subject. You're all here from around the world because you want to be better at being able to make a difference in the world in some way. Perhaps at the micro context of a neighborhood or a family or a set of communities, or maybe at a more macro context in terms of your region or your state or your nation, or maybe an issue that falls across boundaries, like trade or environment or poverty, so forth, human rights. So it turns out that people generally have always, throughout human history, learned practice by doing, by apprenticing themselves, or just through the experiencing of life. Now, the way I try to make that real for my own students is to have developed teaching methods to help people learn from their own experience. First of all, I want you to learn from your own past experience. If you could capture lessons from your own case material and begin to see new options for how you could have operated differently if you had only thought about it or known better at the time, those lessons will tend to stick with you. They'll stick with you more than if we were to present you with somebody else's case, like a pre-prepared case, like a Harvard Business School or a management case. If you can learn from your own cases and help each other learn from each other's cases, I think those lessons are much more likely to be transferable into your future work lives. So we're going to be drawing on your own cases, and that means that over the course, we want you to be thinking in the back of your mind about the case that you brought. And we will have some dedicated time for you to discuss some of these cases, your cases with each other. But primarily, I want you to keep that case in mind so that as I begin to present to you abstract ideas, concepts, you can be testing out, do these ideas help me see things a little bit differently? And I think we will really have succeeded if you see some new options. Imagine that this is sort of a dance floor and we're in motion, or a playing field, in sports. When you're on the playing field or on the dance floor, you generally only see the people right near you. If you're dancing, you see maybe the person you're dancing with and a few other people close by. But if you were able to get up onto a balcony and look down, you'd see that there's a larger playing field. There's a lot going on. You may begin to notice that when the music is fast, some people are dancing, and when the music's slow, other people are dancing. And you may notice that there's some people who are sitting out to dance all the time. They're not actually on the balcony, they're just preoccupied with not dancing. But the balcony is a place from which you can sort of step back, even emotionally, a little bit more detached, and observe and try to then, in a diagnostic way, make sense of where are we now, what's happened, so that you can then go back onto the dance floor and make your next move. And in leadership, the capacity to move from action to reflection, back to action, back to reflection, to move from the dance floor of action to the balcony of reflection and back and forth is really critical. Because without that capacity, you can't take corrective action. You can't mid-course correct. So you end up compounding your mistakes. And in leadership, people make mistakes every day. Sometimes they're small tactical mistakes. Again, the way they framed an issue, or the sequence in which they talked to people, or the fact that they didn't collect information over here about the situation. And we find then in leadership that actually the most common sources of failure are diagnostic. If you get the problem wrong, generally the action's going to be wrong. All of this is beginning to help us explain why we see so little leadership from people in authority. So how would you disappoint people at a rate they can stand? And that becomes a very practical and, in fact, common question in the practice of leadership. Because if people expect you, particularly if you're trying to lead from an authority position, if people expect you to know, but you're saying we don't know, and in fact, you're part of the problem. My surgical handiwork can only solve part of the problem in the operating room by giving you new vessels to your heart. But the other part of the problem remains in you. So let's step back then and focus on trying to understand the nature of authority. And put the term leadership let's put it on the shelf for right now. Because leadership almost always gets practiced in some social matrix, in some social setting in which there are authority relationships. It's like the turbulence and the gravity that you have to take into account if you're going to fly. Leadership is usually practiced in some context, even if you're leading without any authority, you still need to understand that you're leading into a social system in which there are authority structures and authority relationships. So let's put leadership aside and just try to understand the nature of authority. How would you define authority? Yeah.
Capacity to enforce.
The capacity to enforce. Well, wait a second. If I take a knife to you and say, give me your wallet, I have the capacity to enforce. What makes it authority versus simply the exercise of crude power? Not all crude power is authority. What makes something an authority relationship?
You said earlier that you have somehow been authorized to hold a position or to conduct a task. So you could be authorized by a vote, you could be authorized by a hiring, an employment situation.
So the term authorized gives us a little clue into how to define authority.
The will of the person, the perception that I am willingly giving you authority is the difference between enforcing and actual, real, authentic authority.
Okay,
but,
great.
But this perception
Yes.
may
It's
be,
consent, right?
may be incorrect. That's what we were discussing in the break. We had an adaptive challenge to accepting the new model. So we were actually discussing when people have leaders who have a lot of physical force. So I grow up in this environment where this person is basically the person who has authority, and everybody's accepted that.
Yes.
And got used to it, and
Yes.
we forgot where this person got the authority from. So somehow we perceive that we are willingly giving this person authority.
Wonderful insight. Yes. So you could say in a way that people could grow up in a situation, they could grow up in an environment, in a country or a community, where they just learn, they don't think about it, that this is the authority, this is how the world works, this person has authority, and they, by habit, they learn to defer to that person. And it's not so much a conscious and deliberate entrusting or empowering that person. It's not so much a conscious choice, I give you power. It's more like by habit.
Yeah.
Or it's just the water you swim in. You know, you don't know, you wouldn't even imagine any alternative.
Well, I think it's institutionalized structure. So, you know, it's a framework that we've been given.
Yes.
That's the rule.
Yes.
We accept it.
Yes.
And so therefore, that is the authority.
Yes.
Even if I don't vote for it or give consent, it is what has been dictated.
No,
Yes.
but on some level you give up your personal power, and that's how the person acquires the authority.
Yes. Somehow you give them your power. You give
Yeah.
them, you give them
Personal
power.
power, yeah.
Yeah.
But still, even in that context, a person, authoritarian ruler, etc., still derives the power from the people, just not through active act of voting, but through their consent that they learn to accept. I mean, because they don't see any alternative and they don't think there is an alternative to that.
Yes, so in some ways, the authority of authorities, the power that authorities have, is it might be consciously and deliberately authorized, they're authorized by a very deliberate process, a thoughtful process, but it could be, as you're saying, that the authorization is more implicit, assumed, habitual, and almost unconscious. It's just how people grow up. That these are the authorities, I learned to play the rules by the game, this is what it means to be a good child, a good teenager, a good worker, a good citizen in this world that I live in which these are the authorities. But you're saying there is a tacit deference where on some level the source of the power is in the compliance of the people. And it could be habitual compliance or it could be deliberate, voting, deliberate authorization. But in both cases, the power ultimately comes from those people who do the authorizing.
How is that different than the gun example? Because if we're saying it's based on consent, I mean, ultimately, they're holding the gun to your head, but you consent to give up whatever they're taking from you, right? So,
to some extent, maybe like taxation. You're also giving your money through taxes, but you're doing that consciously because you want to have healthcare, etc., etc. Whereas a person at gunpoint just taking the money without your consent.
But I'm still consenting to give it to them. It's
coercion.
But it's not
right?
voluntary, right?
Yeah.
Oh yes, okay, so good. So what's the difference?